October 1943. In the mountains of Italy, the village of Calvi Vecchia had already fallen into Allied hands. British soldiers of the 56th Division held the town, alive, exhausted, and unaware that death was already on its way. American bombers were warming their engines, orders signed, coordinates locked. Then the radios failed. With minutes left before the strike, a single carrier Pigeon was released into the sky. His name was G.I. Joe. In 20 minutes, he flew 20 miles through flak and weather, reaching the airbase just as the bombers began to taxi. The raid was aborted. More than 1,000 Allied soldiers were spared. In a war of machines, steel, and firepower, it was a bird that stopped the bombs. October 18, 1943. The rugged terrain north of the Volturno River, Campania, Italy. The mid-morning mist clings to the olive groves and the stone walls of the Campanian countryside as the men of the British 56th Infantry Division, known distinctively by their emblem as the Black Cats, navigate the difficult ground. The momentum of the Italian campaign has shifted. Just days prior, the Allies had successfully breached the Volturno line, a significant defensive barrier established by the German Wehrmacht to stall the Allied push toward Rome. The fighting has been methodical and arduous, characterized by river crossings under fire and the navigation of roads systematically destroyed by retreating German engineers. On this particular morning, the strategic objective is clear but daunting: the village of Calvi Vecchia. This settlement serves as a critical juncture on the route north. Allied intelligence and forward reconnaissance have indicated that the village is heavily fortified by German rearguard units, likely elements of the 14 Panzer Corps, intending to buy time for their main forces to establish the next defensive line further north at the Garigliano and Rapido rivers. The formidable winter line that to overcome this anticipated resistance. The Allied command structure has orchestrated a coordinated combined arms approach. The doctrine of close air support is being utilized to clear the path for the infantry. A request has been lodged and confirmed by the Tactical Air Command. A heavy aerial bombardment is scheduled to target Calvi Vecchia later that morning. The objective is to neutralize German defensive positions, dismantle artillery emplacements, and soften the village to minimize British casualties during the final assault. The aircraft assigned to this mission are sitting on the tarmac at an Allied airfield roughly 20 miles away, likely near the coast where the logistical footprint of the U.S. Fifth Army is established. These are American bombers, armed and fueled, their crews conducting final pre-flight checks. The operational orders are strict: level the target coordinates to ensure the safety of the advancing British infantry. The coordination relies entirely on a strict timetable and the assumption that the Germans will hold the town until the bombs fall. However, the reality on the ground begins to diverge rapidly from the operational maps at headquarters. As the lead elements of the 56th Division, specifically the 169th Queen's Brigade, push forward, they encounter a situation that defies their briefings. Instead of the withering machine gun fire and mortar barges expected from a firmly entrenched enemy, the British troops find the resistance melting away. The German commanders, prioritizing the preservation of their forces for the stronger defensive lines to the north, have ordered a premature withdrawal. By late morning, British patrols enter the outskirts of Calvi Vecchia. They move cautiously past silent farmhouses and abandoned checkpoints, expecting an ambush that never comes. The realization spreads through the ranks with a mixture of relief and dawning horror. The village is not a German stronghold. It is now occupied territory. The British 56th Division has secured the objective hours ahead of schedule. The soldiers of the 56th move into the town center, securing the perimeter and checking buildings. The civilian population of Calvi Vecchia, having survived the German occupation, now finds itself hosting the British liberators. The town square fills with Allied vehicles, equipment, and approximately 1,000 troops who believe the hard fighting for the day is over. They are unaware that they are standing directly on the focal point of a massive American air raid scheduled to commence in less than 30 minutes. The situation is a catastrophic failure of synchronization caused by success. The infantry has outperformed the timetable, moving faster than the communication loop can track. In the command post, the officers of the 56th Division realize the grave implication of their position. They are occupying the target box. The coordinates sent to the 12 Air Support Command identify their exact location as the center of enemy resistance. Major General Gerald Templer, commanding the division, and his signals officers immediately turned to their primary means of communication, the wireless radio. The rugged, mountainous geography of Italy has plagued Allied communications since the initial landings at Salerno. The signals equipment, heavy and often temperamental, struggles against the interference caused by the mineral-rich rock and the deep valleys. Frantic operators attempt to raise the airfield. They need to transmit a cancel mission order immediately. The airwaves are filled with static. They try different frequencies, adjusting the aerials, checking the batteries and connections. The operator speaks urgently into the handset, repeating the call signs, desperate for an acknowledgement from the American airbase. There is only silence and static in return. The minutes tick away. The 56th Division is isolated electronically. A runner cannot cover the 20 miles of broken, traffic-clogged roads in time. A Jeep dispatch would face the same obstacles, blown bridges, mud, and the friction of a moving army. The American bombers are taxiing. The engines are warming up. The bomb bays are loaded with high-explosive ordnance designed to flatten stone structures, the very structures now sheltering the British troops. The officers look to the sky, knowing that the drone of engines will be the first and last warning of the impending friendly fire incident. The safety of 1,000 men, and the Italian civilians alongside them, rests on the ability to send a message across 20 miles of hostile terrain without a radio. It is in this moment of technological failure that the British Army turns to an ancient method of warfare, one that operates without batteries or frequencies. The frantic call goes out for the Royal Corps of Signals Pigeon Service. The command post of the 56th Division is a flurry of controlled chaos. Maps are spread across the hoods of Willis Jeeps, weighted down by ammunition crates and helmets, while the radio operators continue their futile attempts to pierce the electromagnetic static shielding the Allied airfield from their pleas. The silence from the receiver is deafening against the backdrop of the bustling village. Every minute that passes without contact brings the payload of the American tactical bomber squadrons closer to release. In the shadow of a stone wall, a member of the Signal Corps retrieves a wicker transport basket. While the 56th is a British formation, the logistical realities of the Italian campaign often result in a blending of resources. The bird inside the basket is American-bred, a soldier of the U.S. Army Signal Corps, loaned to the forward units for precisely this type of communication blackout. His service number is USA 43 SC 6390, a bird of dark checker plumage hatched in Algiers just 7 months prior, in March 1943. He is known to his handlers simply as G.I. Joe. The use of homing pigeons in 1943, amidst an era of high-frequency radios and radar, seems an anachronism to the modern observer. Yet, the Signal Corps on both sides of the conflict maintain thousands of these birds for one undeniable reason. They operate independently of technology. They require no batteries. They are unaffected by mountain ranges that block radio waves, and they maintain radio silence, making them undetectable to enemy interceptors. G.I. Joe is part of a mobile loft system, a distinct unit where birds are trained to recognize a specific mobile trailer as home, even as that trailer moves behind the advancing front lines. In this specific theater, his home loft has been stationed at the 12 Air Support Command base, the exact location where the bombers are currently engines running that a signals officer hurriedly scribbles the critical message on a small pad of ultra-thin rice paper. The message is brief and unequivocal. It contains the coordinates of Calvi Vecchia and the confirmed status of the British occupation. The text explicitly demands the immediate cancellation of the bombing run scheduled for the village. The officer folds the paper into a tight, compact cylinder G.I. Joe is removed from the transport basket. The handler holds the bird firmly but gently, smoothing the feathers to ensure the animal is calm. The bird's heart rate is naturally high, but the handler checks for signs of distress that might impede the flight. In the chaotic environment of a newly captured town, with the noise of trucks and the shouting of infantrymen, the bird is the only calm point of focus. The officer takes the small aluminum message capsule attached to the bird's leg. He slides the rolled rice paper inside and screws the cap shut. This tiny cylinder now contains the only hope for the 1,000 men of the 169th Brigade and the civilians of Calvi Vecchia. The process of releasing a homing pigeon is not as simple as throwing it into the air. The bird must orient itself. Upon release, a pigeon will typically ascend and circle the location several times, using the sun and the magnetic fields of the Earth to determine the azimuth that leads home. In a time-critical situation, these circling minutes can be agonizing for the soldiers on the ground watching the sky. The handler steps into a clear space in the village square, away from the telegraph wires and the overhang of the ruined buildings. He lifts his hands and tosses G.I. Joe upward. The bird catches the air, his wings beating rapidly to gain altitude. Below him lies the dusty, tile-roofed expanse of the village. To the north are the retreating German columns. To the south, the Allied rear echelon. G.I. Joe ascends, spirals once to lock onto his internal compass, and then, without the usual hesitation or prolonged circling that often characterizes a release, he snaps onto a southern trajectory that he levels out, his airspeed increasing rapidly. Pigeons are capable of remarkable speeds, often averaging 40 to 50 miles per hour in neutral wind conditions. However, G.I. Joe is flying with a tailwind and an urgency that seems almost unnatural. He commits to the flight path, a straight line over the treacherous, uneven terrain of the Campanian plain. Back on the ground, the soldiers of the 56th Division watch the bird become a speck in the distance and then vanish. They check their watches. The flight distance is approximately 20 miles. Under normal circumstances, a Jeep dispatch rider would take nearly an hour to navigate the cratered roads, bypass the demolished bridges, and negotiate the checkpoints. A radio transmission would take seconds, but the radios are dead. The bird is their only timeline. They calculate the minutes. The bombers are scheduled to be over the target shortly. If the bird falters, if he is taken by a hawk, distracted by a flock, or shot down by a stray round from a German rearguard sniper, the mission fails. The officers return to their maps, waiting for the sound of engines. They can do nothing else. The fate of the brigade is now entirely airborne, carried on a wingspan of less than 30 inches. High above the scarred landscape, G.I. Joe flies alone. He passes over the Volturno River, the site of the fierce battles just days before. He flies over the artillery batteries and the supply depots. He is a singular biological entity moving against the massive mechanical flow of the war. He covers a mile every minute. The wind rushes over the aluminum canister on his leg. He is 20 miles from home, and he is closing the distance at a speed that will later be recorded as one of the fastest flights in the history of the Pigeon service. While G.I. Joe battles the wind currents over the Volturno Valley, the atmosphere at the 12 Air Support Command Base is one of deafening mechanical purpose. Located safely behind the front lines, the airfield is a sprawling, dusty complex of temporary hangars, fuel depots, and pierced steel planking, PSP, runways designed to handle heavy aircraft traffic on Italian soil. The heat of the engines distorts the air above the tarmac. The aircraft assigned to the Calvi Vecchia mission are American medium bombers, likely B-25 Mitchells or A-20 Havocs, rugged, twin-engine aircraft designed specifically for the kind of low-level, precision destruction required to dislodge entrenched infantry. The ground crews have finished their work. The bomb bays are loaded with high-explosive ordnance. The fuse is set. The fuel trucks have pulled away, and the chocks are waiting to be pulled from the wheels. Inside the cockpits, the pilots and bombardiers run through their pre-flight checklists. The mood is professional and focused. To them, Calvi Vecchia is just a grid reference, a box on a map marked with red grease pencil indicating hostile German resistance. They have been briefed that the British advance has stalled and that the Wehrmacht is digging in. They believe their payload will save British lives by softening up the target before the ground assault begins. They have no way of knowing that the men they intend to support are currently smoking cigarettes and brewing tea in the very buildings targeted for destruction. The squadron leader watches the signals from the control tower. The timeline is rigid. In air operations, coordination is paramount. The infantry assault is timed to occur immediately after the bombing to exploit the shock and confusion. If the planes are late, the infantry waits exposed. If they are early, they might miss the enemy concentration. The engines roar to life, a synchronized thrum that vibrates through the ground. The propellers blur into invisible disks of forced at the edge of the airfield. Removed from the noise of the flight line sits the mobile Pigeon loft of the signal corps. It is a converted trailer painted in olive drab, housing dozens of birds. The Pigeoneers, specialized soldiers trained in the care and handling of the birds, go about their daily maintenance. They scrape the coops, check the feed mix, and inspect the birds for mites or fatigue. It is a quiet, almost agrarian corner of a modern mechanized war. They are not expecting a message from the 56th Division. The radio is the primary tool of war. The pigeons are the contingency, the backup for the backup. The arrival of a bird usually signifies a catastrophic failure of modern equipment or a unit cut off behind enemy lines. Suddenly, a shape drops from the sky. G.I. Joe does not circle the loft to bleed off energy, a behavior common among homing pigeons returning from a flight. Instead, he dives straight for the landing board of the mobile trailer. He has covered 20 miles in exactly 20 minutes. He hits the landing trap, a set of one-way swinging wires that allow the bird to enter the loft but prevent it from leaving. With exhaustion evident in his posture, the sound of the trap clicking triggers an immediate reaction from the pigeoneer on duty. In the signal corps, a returning bird is a priority event. The soldier steps quickly to the coop, his hands moving with practiced speed. He spots the bird, identifying the distinct dark checker pattern. He reaches in, securing G.I. Joe, and immediately sees the aluminum capsule strapped to the bird's reddish leg. Outside, the noise of the airfield is rising. The lead bombers are beginning to taxi. The screech of brakes and the revving of radial engines signal the beginning of the takeoff sequence. The aircraft are moving from their revetments toward the main runway. Once they are airborne, recalling them becomes significantly more difficult. Radio silence protocols, the possibility of frequency drift, and the focus of the pilots on formation flying mean that the window to stop the attack is closing with every rotation of the propellers. The pigeoneer unscrews the capsule. His fingers, perhaps shaking slightly with the adrenaline of the moment, extract the thin, rolled rice paper. He unrolls it and reads the scrawled handwriting of the British officer from Calvi Vecchia. The message is clear. The British captured the village. The Germans are gone. Cancel the raid. Friendly troops in the kill zone. The realization hits the soldier with the force of a physical blow. The planes taxiing a few hundred yards away are carrying death for 1,000 Allied soldiers. There is no time to call the tower on the field telephone and hope the operator answers. There is no time to file a formal report. The pigeoneer sprints. Clutching the piece of rice paper, the soldier runs from the pigeon loft toward the Air Traffic Control Operations Center. The distance is short, but the stakes are infinite. He bursts into the control room, breathless, thrusting the paper at the air operations officer. Call it off. Call it off. The officer takes the paper, scanning the coordinates and the signature. He looks out the window. The lead bomber is at the head of the runway, the pilot likely running up the engines for the final magneto check before release. The officer grabs the flare pistol, the emergency signal for immediate airfield shutdown, or grabs the direct line to the tower controller. Abort. Abort takeoff. Mission canceled. The order goes out over the tower frequency, crackling into the headsets of the pilots. On the runway, the lead pilot throttles back. The nose of the bomber dips slightly as the brakes engage. The propellers slow their frantic spin. The aircraft behind him come to a halt. A line of frustrated mechanical beasts denied their hunt. The raid is stopped. The engines are cut. The silence that follows on the airfield is the sound of 1,000 men surviving. Back in the loft, G.I. Joe drinks water, preening his feathers, unaware that his 20-minute sprint has just altered the course of the Italian campaign for the 56th Division. At Calvi Vecchia, the sun climbs higher toward its zenith. The men of the 169th Brigade, the Queen's Brigade, remain in a state of high alert, though the nature of the threat has shifted in their minds from German counterattack to Allied negligence. The officers continue to scan the southern horizon, binoculars pressed to their eyes, searching for the telltale silhouettes of B-25 Mitchells or the glint of sunlight on aluminum fuselages. The timeline for the bombardment comes and goes. The air above the village remains remarkably, miraculously still. There is no drone of radial engines, no whistle of falling ordnance, and no earth-shattering concussions reducing the medieval stone of the village to rubble. The The silence is heavy, filled only by the idling of British truck engines and the distant, sporadic pop of small arms fire from the retreating German rearguard miles to the north. Slowly, the tension in the command post begins to dissipate. The realization takes hold. The message got through. The radio operators, still sweating over their static-filled sets, lower their headsets. They never established contact, yet the result they prayed for has been achieved. The survival of the brigade is confirmed not by a transmission received, but by the absence of destruction. For Major General Gerald Templer and the command staff of the 56th Division, the relief is tempered by the stark reality of how close disaster had loomed. In the annals of military history, friendly fire or blue-on-blue incidents are a tragic constant, often resulting from the friction of war, the gap between the speed of movement and the speed of communication. Had the bombers arrived, the physical damage to the 169th Brigade would have been catastrophic. A concentrated tactical bombing run on a village center occupied by 1,000 troops in soft-skin vehicles and open cover would have decimated the unit's combat effectiveness. It would have necessitated a halt in the advance, the evacuation of hundreds of casualties, and a crushing blow to morale just as the momentum of the Italian campaign was building. Instead, because of a single bird, the 56th Division remains intact. They are combat ready. The logistical tail can catch up, the wounded from the previous days can be tended to, and the advance toward the winter line can continue without the burden of a mass casualty event caused by their own side. Back at the airfield, the scene is one of frustration turned to sober reflection. The pilots and bombardiers, initially annoyed at the aborted sortie, a mission scrubbed after all the pre-flight labor, receive the intelligence briefing regarding the cancellation. The anger evaporates instantly. To a man, the aircrews realized that they were minutes away from killing their brothers in arms. The camaraderie between the ground forces and the Air Corps is a vital psychological component of the Allied effort. Severing that trust with a negligent bombing would have had ripple effects throughout the theater. The ground crews begin the laborious and dangerous task of downloading the ordnance. The bombs, fused and ready for war, must be carefully removed from the racks and returned to the bunkers. It is heavy, sweating work under the Italian sun, but it is done with a sense of gratitude. Every bomb returned to storage is a potential tragedy averted. In the mobile Pigeon loft, the hero of the hour is simply another bird in the coop. G.I. Joe's feat, however, begins to circulate among the Signal Corps personnel. The Pigeoneers examine the flight data. 20 miles in 20 minutes. It is a statistic that defies the standard operational expectations for a carrier pigeon. While pigeons are swift, a sustained speed of 60 miles per hour over broken terrain, navigating the thermal currents and downdrafts of the Italian hills, is exceptional. Ornithologists and signal officers later analyzing the flight would attribute the speed to a combination of a favorable tailwind and the bird's peak physical condition. But to the soldiers on the ground, it seems almost providential. G.I. Joe did not meander. He flew with the singular purpose of a creature returning to its sanctuary, unaware that his instinct for home was the mechanism of salvation for an entire brigade. The incident at Calvi Vecchia serves as a stark validation of the U.S. Army Pigeon service. In an era where the Allies were deploying the first rudimentary computers, like the Colossus, and utilizing advanced radar, the reliance on a rock dove, a species used for messaging since the time of ancient Rome, proved that technology has limits. When the vacuum tubes failed and the atmospheric interference blinded the radios, biology succeeded. This event solidifies the reputation of the pigeon detachments within the Fifth Army. They are no longer viewed as antiquated novelties, but as essential, fail-safe communication nodes. As the 56th Division prepares to move out from Calvi Vecchia, leaving the unscathed village behind, the story of the bird begins to travel up the chain of command. It moves from the tactical reports of the signal officers to the desk of the Corps commanders. The war will continue. The bloody battles of Monte Cassino and Anzio lie ahead. But for one October morning, the machinery of death was halted by the beating of wings. The 1,000 men of the 56th Division lived to fight another day, unaware that their lives were purchased by a 20-minute sprint across the sky. The war in Italy did not end at Calvi Vecchia. The conflict ground onward, a slow and punishing ascent up the boot of the peninsula. The 56th Division, having narrowly escaped annihilation by their own air support, continued their push toward the winter line, facing the brutal battles of Monte Cassino and the Garigliano Crossing. Through the mud, the cold, and the relentless artillery duels of 1944, the story of the Pigeon that outflew the bombers became a piece of regimental folklore, a bright spot in the grim narrative of the campaign. G.I. Joe continued his service with the U.S. Army Signal Corps. Like the soldiers he served alongside, he was a veteran of the Mediterranean theater, moving with the mobile lofts as the front line shifted north. He survived the hazards of his trade, the predatory hawks that hunted carrier pigeons, the German marksmen ordered to shoot birds on sight, and the harsh weather conditions of the Apennines. By the time the German forces in Italy surrendered in May 1945, G.I. Joe had done his duty. He was rotated back to the United States, retiring to the U.S. Army's Pigeon Breeding and Training Center at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey. However, military bureaucracy, often slow to recognize individual acts of heroism in the heat of battle, eventually caught up with the records of October 18, 1943. The flight log from the 12 Air Support Command and the testimony of the British 56th Division officers were reviewed. The significance of that 20-minute flight became legally and historically codified. It was determined that no other single event involving a military animal in the war had saved as many lives in a single instance that in 1946, a year after the guns fell silent, G.I. Joe was recalled to duty for one final mission. This time, however, he was not carrying a message of desperation, but traveling to receive the gratitude of a nation he had saved. He was transported from the United States to London, England. The destination was the Tower of London, the historic fortress that had served as a palace, prison, and armory for nearly 1,000 years. It was a fitting setting for a ceremony rooted in the ancient tradition of recognizing valor. The date was set for November 4th, 1946. The award G.I. Joe was to receive was the Dickin Medal. Instituted in 1943 by Maria Dickin, the founder of the People's Dispensary for Sick Animals, PDSA, the medal was the animal equivalent of the Victoria Cross or the Medal of Honor. It was a large bronze medallion, bearing the inscriptions "For Gallantry" and "We Also Serve," suspended from a ribbon of green, dark brown, and pale blue, colors representing water, earth, and air on the day of the ceremony. The atmosphere at the tower was formal and somber, respectful of the gravity of the award. High-ranking military officials, press photographers, and the keepers of the tower gathered in the crisp autumn air. Major General Charles Cately, a distinguished British officer who had commanded V Corps, the parent formation of the 56th Division during the Italian campaign, presided over the event. It was a poignant reunion of sorts. Cately was there to represent the very men who would not have been alive to see the end of the war without the bird's intervention. When the citation was read, the details of the flight at Calvi Vecchia were spoken into the public record. The citation credited G.I. Joe with the most outstanding flight made by a United States Army homing pigeon in World War II. It officially acknowledged that his speed and endurance had prevented the bombing of the village and saved the lives of at least 1,000 British soldiers of the 56th, London, Division. A.S. Major General Cately fastened the medal to G.I. Joe's collar. The bird sat perched on a handler's hand, calm and indifferent to the flashbulbs of the press. He was the first non-British pigeon to receive the award, and notably, the only American animal to receive the Dickin Medal during the Second World War. Later conflicts would see more American recipients. The image of the American general praising the small bird amidst the stone walls of London captured the imagination of the public. It underscored a unique aspect of the war. Despite the industrial scale of the conflict, the tanks, the atomic bombs, the radar, the connection between man and animal remained a vital, life-saving link. G.I. Joe's presence in London was more than a ceremonial novelty. It was a testament to the thousands of pigeons, dogs, and horses that had served in the Signal Corps, the Medical Corps, and the transport lines. Most remained anonymous, their services recorded only in dusty logbooks. G.I. Joe stood as the representative for them all. Following the ceremony, G.I. Joe was treated as a celebrity. He was featured in newspapers and newsreels across the Allied nations. But unlike the human heroes who struggled to reintegrate into civilian life, G.I. Joe had a designated path waiting for him. his war was officially over. He would return to the United States not just as a retired military asset, but as a decorated hero, destined for a long life far removed from the artillery fire of the Volturno line. The bird was loaded back onto a transport for the flight across the Atlantic, the bronze metal packed safely away. The village of Calvi Vecchia was rebuilding, the rubble of the war slowly being cleared, but in the archives of the British Army and the U.S. Signal Corps, the coordinates of the town would forever be linked to the flight of Bird USA 43 SC 6390. Spring 1957. The Detroit Zoological Park, Michigan. The world has changed profoundly since the desperate days of the Italian campaign. The propeller-driven bombers that G.I. Joe once raced against have largely been scrapped, replaced by the sleeker, terrifying silhouettes of jet-powered strategic bombers. The radio sets that failed the 56th Division in the mountains of Campania have evolved into sophisticated transistorized communication networks. The Cold War is in full freeze, and the technology of warfare has advanced into the atomic age. In this new era of intercontinental ballistic missiles and satellite telemetry, the concept of a military homing pigeon has become an affectionate obsolescence. It is in this context that the United States Army makes the difficult administrative decision to disband the pigeon service. For decades, the Signal Corps had maintained thousands of birds, training them for a war that no longer existed. The order comes down to close the lofts at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey. The vast majority of the birds, the standard issue soldiers of the flock, are sold to hobbyists or auctioned off to racing clubs. They are demobilized into civilian anonymity. However, exceptions are made for the heroes. The Army recognizes that certain veterans, regardless of species, are not surplus inventory. G.I. Joe, now 14 years old, a geriatric age for a rock dove, whose wild counterparts rarely survive past 5 years, is classified as a distinct historical figure. Along with a select few other decorated birds, he is transferred from the closing military lofts to the care of the Detroit Zoological Park. The transfer is executed with the dignity of a VIP movement. When G.I. Joe arrives in Detroit, he is not placed in a general aviary. He is given a habitat that reflects his status. The zoo staff, aware of the fragile nature of their new charge, monitor his diet and health meticulously. He becomes a living exhibit of the Second World War. Visitors to the zoo in the late 1950s encounter a bird that looks remarkably unremarkable. His dark checker plumage has grayed slightly, and his movements are slower, more deliberate. He spends his days perched on a wooden dowel, preening the feathers that once cut through the Italian headwinds at 60 miles per hour. The plaque outside his enclosure tells the story of Calvi Vecchia, of the 20 minutes that saved 1,000 men. Parents read the text to their children, pointing out the small bird dozing in the sun, trying to bridge the gap between this quiet creature and the violence of the bombardment he prevented. G.I. Joe's longevity becomes a final act of defiance against the odds. He outlives the generals who commanded the armies in Italy. He outlives the very airframes of the B-25 Mitchells he raced. He lives to see the dawn of the space race. In the care of the zookeepers, he is insulated from the hawks and the harsh weather that claimed so many of his kin. He becomes a symbol of endurance that on June 3, 1961, the inevitable catch of time finally reaches the hero of Calvi Vecchia. G.I. Joe passes away in his sleep at the Detroit Zoo. He is 18 years old. In human terms, based on the comparative aging of the species, he has lived to be well over 100. The death of the bird is reported in newspapers across the United States and Great Britain. It is treated not as a curiosity, but as the passing of a notable veteran. The British 56th Division, many of whose members are now middle-aged men with families of their own, owes its post-war existence to this creature. The letters and tributes that follow his death reflect a genuine sense of loss. But the Army is not ready to let G.I. Joe disappear into the earth. The decision is made to preserve him physically, ensuring that future generations can see the vessel that carried the message of survival. His remains are sent to a taxidermist, a final procedure to immortalize the physical form of the bird. The work is done with great care, posing him in an alert stance, head high, wings folded. The posture of a bird ready to be basketed for a mission. He is mounted on a simple wooden base. The inscription is brief, detailing his name, his service number, and his accolades. He is then returned to the custody of the military, specifically the U.S. Army Communications Electronics Museum at Fort Monmouth. Here, G.I. Joe begins his second life as a permanent artifact. He is placed in a glass case, surrounded by the heavy, green-painted radios and field telephones of the era. The contrast is striking. The radios, with their vacuum tubes and heavy batteries, look archaic and clumsy, technology that failed when it was needed most. Beside them stands the bird, the biological backup that succeeded when the machines faltered. For the curators of the museum, G.I. Joe represents the ultimate lesson in military communications, redundancy and reliability. He is a reminder that in the friction of war, the most sophisticated solution is not always the most effective one. Sometimes, the difference between life and death is not a frequency or a circuit, but the homing instinct of a pigeon. As the years turn into decades, the story of the carrier pigeon fades from the general public consciousness, overshadowed by the digital revolution. Yet, G.I. Joe remains on his perch behind the glass. He stands as a silent sentinel to a bygone era of warfare, a time when the sky over Italy was filled with engines, and the only thing standing between a brigade and destruction was a 20-mile sprint by a single, determined bird. The decades following G.I. Joe's death saw the world transform at a velocity that would have been unrecognizable to the soldiers of 1943. The Cold War ended, the Berlin Wall fell, and the digital age reshaped the landscape of human communication. Through it all, the taxidermied form of G.I. Joe remained a quiet fixture within the military's historical archives. However, history is rarely static, and even museums are subject to the logistics of a changing army. In 2011, the base realignment and closure (BRAC) process mandated the shuttering of Fort Monmouth, New Jersey. The base, which had been the spiritual and operational home of the Signal Corps and the Pigeon Service for nearly a century, fell silent. The buildings where the Pigeoneers had once trained thousands of birds for service in Europe and the Pacific were slated for closure or demolition. But the history contained within them had to be preserved. The artifacts of the Communications Electronics Museum, including the glass case containing G.I. Joe, were carefully packed for transport. They were moved south to the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, the new headquarters of the CECOM, Communications Electronics Command, History Office. Here, in a modern facility surrounded by the cutting-edge technology of 21st century warfare, G.I. Joe found his permanent home. He is displayed today not merely as a curiosity of taxidermy, but as a centerpiece of the Army's heritage. The feathers that once repelled the Italian rain are now protected by climate-controlled glass, shielded from the degradation of time. Beside him often sits his Dickin medal, the bronze medallion dull with age but heavy with significance. To the casual observer walking the halls of the museum, he is a small, motionless bird. But to the historian, he represents a staggering actuarial reality. The true legacy of G.I. Joe is not found in the museum display, but in the genealogy of the British nation. The mathematics of his flight are simple. 20 miles in 20 minutes saved approximately 1,000 men. But the calculus of survival extends far beyond the head count of the 169th Brigade on that October morning. Those 1,000 men, having survived Calvi Vecchia, went on to live their lives. Some fell in later battles at the Garigliano or Anzio, tragic casualties of a war that had much left to take. But hundreds survived to see the armistice. They returned to the smog of London, the hills of Scotland, and the collieries of Wales. They married, they fathered children, and they grew old. If one applies the generational multiplier, the concept that each survivor likely produced 2 or 3 descendants in the baby boom era, who in turn produced their own children and grandchildren. The number of lives owed to that single pigeon expands exponentially. By the 21st century, it is statistically probable that tens of thousands of people walking the streets of the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth exist only because a pigeon did not stop to rest, did not succumb to a hawk, and did not lose his way over the Volturno River. There is a profound, almost haunting beauty in this realization. Entire family trees, with their triumphs, tragedies, inventions, and loves, are rooted in the instinct of a bird designated USA 43 SC 6390. It is the ultimate manifestation of the butterfly effect, though in this case, It was the beating of a pigeon's wings that prevented the hurricane of fire. In the broader context of military history, G.I. Joe remains a singular entity. While other animals were decorated for bravery, dogs that sniffed out mines, horses that carried supplies under fire, G.I. Joe's action was unique in its strategic immediacy. Most animal acts of valor involved saving individuals or small squads. G.I. Joe is credited with saving a brigade. The sheer scale of the potential friendly fire incident places his flight in a category of its own. Today, the story of G.I. Joe is often cited in military academies and signal schools as a lesson in the fog of war. It serves as a check on technological hubris. In an age of satellite communications, drone swarms, and encrypted digital uplinks, the breakdown of the 56th Division's radios in 1943 is a reminder that technology is fallible. The atmosphere, the terrain, and the friction of combat can render the most advanced electronics useless. The solution, as it was in Calvi Vecchia, is often found in the most primal and resilient systems available. The village of Calvi Vecchia itself has moved on. The physical scars of the Second World War have largely been paved over or integrated into the architecture of the modern town. The olive groves where the British infantry nervously watched the sky are now peaceful agricultural lands. The airfield where the American bombers throttled back their engines is long gone, reclaimed by the Italian landscape. Yet, the silence of that morning, the bombardment that never happened, remains the defining sound of the event. It is a silence filled with the lives of the men who were not killed that as the visitor leaves the museum at Aberdeen Proving Ground. Leaving behind the tanks and the radar dishes, the image of the bird persists. G.I. Joe stands in his case, eternally alert, a small bundle of feathers and hollow bones that once carried the weight of 1,000 worlds on his leg. He is the guardian of the cancel order, the savior of the Black Cats, and the most unlikely hero of the Italian campaign that in the vast, tragic, and industrial tapestry of the Second World War, where death was mechanized and dispensed by the ton. The story of G.I. Joe endures as a testament to life. It is the story of how, for 20 desperate minutes, the outcome of the war did not depend on a general, a tank, or a bomb, but on the wings of a bird flying home.